Okay, so this is about cannabis strain triage. I'm going to talk a little bit, because it's relevant to the topic, about how to generally get your grow clean or even mitigate some of the problems with it, and then start going toward using less fungicides. So, talk about the dirty 5, which are the 5 most common pesticides and fungicides that come up. Common cannabis pathogens, the cannabis industry and pesticides and their relationship in general, declining cost-benefit ratios associated with those, and non-chemical abatement strategies. So the dirty 5. We've got imidacloprid, which is an insecticide, apomectin, miticide, and micobutanol. This is actually a pack of cigarettes, but I thought it was pretty funny. There's cigarettes named Eagle 22, so put that up there. One of the things I always start off at the beginning of these talks is that is addressing the elephant in the room. Are these illegal pesticides?
No.
Come on, louder.
No.
First night of Frank Talk. It's your turn to fight.
No.
They're not illegal. Is it legal to use them on cannabis? We're like, that is the elephant in the room. The answer is it depends. In these cases, yes, it's illegal to use them on cannabis. The EPA, which is the federal, most people are unaware of the fact that the EPA, a federal regulatory body, makes decisions on what type of pesticides are allowed on what specific crops, depending on exposure levels, how fast the plant metabolizes them, etc. Why haven't they done this on cannabis?
Schedule 1.
It's Schedule 1. This isn't to paint the EPA in a bad light, but kind of to point out the kind of odd position they're in. Colorado has requested this kind of guidance from the EPA. They said, well, technically it's not a crop, it's a Schedule 1 controlled substance, but here's a little bit of information that we can offer you. So they've offered at least some guidance on what is definitely not allowed, and some general guidance saying, like, you know, if it's considered generally regarded as safe, which is grass, meaning it's not harmful for humans, you can use it at will on cannabis. But there are a lot of conflicting bits of information between the Colorado Department of Agriculture, who are really trying to do the best they can to clarify this, and from MED, and not as much help from the EPA as we'd like, but I think they have not actually been allowed to kind of get into this issue, and they're equally frustrated with this. So, talk about these because many growers, I think my friend Damien said, you're that fucking Eagle 20 guy, right? Like, hate you. And I was like, you got it banned. And I was like, it wasn't approved to begin with. I'm not actually anti-pesticides. Pesticides, when used appropriately, I mean, I work in a lab and I deal with dangerous chemicals all day. When used appropriately, applying technology to a problem is reasonable. So, based on that, kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. And I will talk about how to move away from these, primarily focusing on fungicides today, though. So, say hello to my little friends. What do we got here? These are creepy as hell to like be looking at. You're going under the microscope, you're like in a cool, brave new world, and everything's coming along, and then you see this. And you're like, because it just pops up out of nowhere, and your favorite streak like a little girl. This is a thrip. This is a spider mite. So say hello to them, and then say goodbye to them, because we're not going to talk about them today, except more than briefly. What our lab is focused on is actually dealing with powdery mildew right now, and sometime in the next year, we're actually going to turn our attention toward dealing with pest issues, again with non-chemical strategies. One of them might actually include releasing sterile mites and sterile thrips into a grow. Anyone know why that would work? Anyone familiar with like sterile insect release things?
So then,
You're the scientist.
What's that?
So you're the scientist.
I'm the scientist. Okay, well, I'll use really, really crude terms to describe this. This is a strategy they've used for different types of like agricultural pests. Depending on the species, you can create a whole bunch of one of that gender, sterilize it, and release it out into the wild. If you release out the males, this is what happens. They occupy all the females. And they're shooting blanks, which means that the population goes pew. So we're going to try experimenting with this sometime in the next year. It may or may not work. There's been some work, particularly on russet mites actually, that's been somewhat successful. So this is a way that you introduce these things. They crash out the population because they're humping all the ladies. Sorry, that's pretty much what's going on. They're keeping keeping her occupied. But it's a way to kind of wipe out those populations almost immediately within the surrounding area without actually having devastating ecological consequences and really very little unintended negative effects, because that is literally the only thing that they will target. It's not like those spider mites are like a feeding niche for bats or something like that. They're just little creepy parasites. Okay, so say hello to my other little friend. What do we have here? Powdery mildew. Single most common form of fungal infection on cannabis for very, very good reasons. Powdery mildew is what is termed an obligate biotroph. It is very attuned to its host, and in particular in forms of cannabis, it is very, very specifically attached to certain types, and it seems to have adapted, in this case with the strains I've looked at, to grow environments specific to cannabis. When do you often get powdery mildew in Colorado? It is all year round, but there's relevance to my question here. Do you get it more often at certain times of the year?
Summer.
Fall.
No.
Rain.
Fall and spring. This is really relevant to what we're going to be talking about later on. Okay, so moving away from insecticides and fungicides. This is what I'm going to be talking about, at least for part of this, because again, I'm not saying don't use tools to protect your crop and protect the value of your crop. People have different motivations for doing things, but inevitably, more or less everyone is motivated by money. But there's a couple other broader implications for this too. So, possibility of applying things like pesticides or fungicides to cannabis is that it's going to be consumed by humans, right? What is the only other crop, agricultural product, that is burned upon consumption? Tobacco. The tobacco industry has actually fairly strict regulations on it from the EPA on what is actually allowed in tobacco, when you're allowed to apply it, because of the possibility of combusting that chemical into something harmful. So mildew, for example, is not allowed on tobacco agriculture in the United States. It is allowed in China. There's I know, it's like the irony. Part of the problem with mildew and a lot of those other types of fungicides is that you can create harmful byproducts that would not exist unless you burn them. So mildew, that's the compound found in Evil 20, is relatively non-toxic if you ingest it. If you eat it, your liver absorbs it, detoxifies it, excretes it, very little harm, even in very high amounts. But it's actually it's unknown what all the harmful effects that could occur from burning of it, but it is known that if you pyrolyze it, it creates hydrogen cyanide, because that's part of the active mechanism and chemical moiety on the compound. Okay, so potential harm. This is not always, when we talk with clients about trying to move away from different types of pesticides, this is not always their first concern, because the argument is that people have been smoking cannabis for decades and nobody's died. That's a hard argument to get around. Could be true, could be not, because how would you know? Somebody dies, the doctor's like, yes, seems to be from pesticide on cannabis. So it's not really a great argument, but it is kind of bent into the culture. Legal and compliance issues. Anyone know what this little icon is?
Required
It's required for what?
for any recreational product containing THC.
For edible products now.
Edible.
So to discern ordinary candies or ordinary edibles from other things, manufacturers are now required to stamp their edible products, each individual piece, with this little exclamation point that says THC. I'll keep my opinions on that to myself, but I think it's not going to stop anyone from eating it accidentally or on purpose, or kids or other things. But that money, basically legal compliance issues, including getting busted for having pesticides, it can go up pretty fast. Some of the recalls in the last 6 months have cost manufacturers hundreds of thousands, millions, and that's just in the product. Time, lost product, lost labor. So this is a nice little cannabis flower, a little hourglass, a little fire down there. It's not getting just burned in the way that we would like. A lot of those contaminated products that have even trace amounts of pesticides simply get destroyed. There's no opportunity for the manufacturer to remediate them. I'll talk about this one in a second, but downstream effects. This is for environmental hazards. The wastewater coming from excessive use of insecticides and grows goes directly into Denver's wastewater. And they're starting to study the effects on downstream organisms, including fish, including a lot of other niche species, because these are high levels of these things. So there's a lot of reasons for this, but no matter what your motivation is, it'll always come back to money. Even if it's just brand damage, you get falsely accused of pesticides or not, or you get a recall. Let's think about the lost customers over years who may not ever come back. As a good example, Chipotle has lost money for the first time in its existence for the last 3 quarters after having an E. coli outbreak. It was the first problem they've had, I think, in the entire time of their business, and people are just like, not going back, don't want to get E. coli. And Chipotle is actually a model in the industry for how cleanly their product generally is. Okay, mutant bugs, which we're going to talk about. Using the same types of fungicides leads to resistance. We've identified at least 3 strains of powdery mildew in our lab we've collected from various sites around Denver that are resistant to all of the DMI inhibitors, which are miclobutanol, Eagle 20 is one of them. They simply ignore it. They have been treated with this thing so often that they develop resistance to it. That's a normal response of a pathogen to being treated with the same chemical over and over again. What's another thing that does this? Bacteria. Yeah, staph. So this is now a reoccurring problem. So moving away from fungicides makes sense because you're only going to have to add more and more and more of them to you to get the same effect, and they're expensive and toxic. So we'll kind of show some strategies to kind of move away from this. And the main problem I have with this too is that this powdery mildew probably infects hops as well, and I really like my beer. Relatively inexpensive. They estimate that the cost of fungicide resistance in Oregon has driven up the cost of beer, or at least hops production, by 10% in the last year. And so think about that in terms of the cost of producing marijuana. All of these things funnel back into lots of money going down the drain. All right, so these are all the reasons why, and now I'm going to tell you how to do this.